I need you to lean in close because what I'm about to share may completely overturn everything you've ever pictured about standing before God. Last night, in the silence of my room, I dared to ask him a question I had been too afraid to whisper for most of my life. What will you truly say to us when we finally stand before you? The response that came wasn't a gentle reassurance or a vague impression. It shattered every framework I thought I understood about judgment, about accountability, about the final day when nothing can be hidden. 5 questions rose in my spirit, 5 divine invitations, and they were nothing like the doctrines I had been taught. They were not centered on guilt, failure, or performance. Instead, they unveiled a heart so unexpected that I still find myself trembling between awe and liberation. I'm telling you this now while standing outside a quiet little church in my neighborhood. The sun is melting into the horizon behind the steeple, and faint hymns drift through the open doors. It should feel serene. It should calm me. Yet inside, my thoughts are still storming, restless, ever since my prayer this morning. Not long ago, we wrapped the 5th season of The Chosen, and production on season 6 is already consuming my days. Every line, every gesture, every scene has me carrying the weight of portraying Jesus, his words, his gaze, his heart. But even as I live inside that role, a deeper unease gnaws at me. What will it actually be like when I stand before the real Christ? I've walked as a Christian for years, yet the thought of Judgment Day has always pressed down on me like a shadow. Not because I doubt God's love, but because I grew up seeing that final encounter as a courtroom, a cosmic tribunal where failures were read like charges, where sins were piled like evidence, and where heaven's record books turned their pages against me. That image haunted me. I lay awake many nights as a boy, imagining God as a stern judge, tallying every selfish choice, every careless word, every time I chose comfort over compassion. But something shifted during filming this season. Day after day, embodying Jesus made me notice subtleties I had never seen before, the tenderness in his eyes, the way he leaned toward the broken, the way he looked past failures straight into hearts. It did not resemble the rigid, disappointed God of my childhood sermons. And so, after the rest of my family left for church this morning, I lingered in the prayer room. I knelt low, forehead to the floor, and finally let the question escape. Lord, when that day comes, what will you actually ask me? I braced myself for silence. I braced myself to feel foolish. Who was I to think God might reveal his eternal priorities to an actor still fumbling his way through faith? Yet what flooded my spirit next overturned decades of fear. For years, I rehearsed explanations, prepared defenses, carried apologies in my pocket like weapons against divine anger. I was raised to believe every action tipped a cosmic scale, that eternity hinged on performance, that heaven itself was a test I was destined to fail. And the weight of that belief slowly stole the joy from my relationship with Jesus. I've spoken with so many others who live under the same burden. They love God, they want to follow Christ, yet they feel they are sitting for an exam without knowing the questions, terrified they'll never measure up, constantly anxious that one misstep will disappoint the very one they long to please. And that quiet terror bled into my portrayal of Jesus. How could I show authentic grace while privately fearing rejection? How could I offer warmth on screen when in my own heart I was bracing for cold judgment? That's why I pushed past my fear and asked. I needed to know if the Jesus I was portraying was the Jesus who would meet me at the end. I needed to know if his love truly ran without condition, or if hidden demands would surface on the last day. The not knowing was corroding my faith, and I suspect you may feel this same ache. Perhaps you've wondered the same. If you have, tell me where you're watching from. Let me know what time it is right now, because I want to know we're in this search together. Back on my knees, I poured it all out. Every regret, every inadequacy, every season of weakness. I asked if these failures would be read back to me one day, if the ledger of my life would drown me in shame. But instead of condemnation, an unexpected peace washed through the room. It felt as though Christ himself sat across from me, eyes warm, smile rising not with severity, but with good news. I opened my Bible, and my gaze landed on John 5:24. Whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged but has crossed over from death to life. I had read those words countless times, yet suddenly they pierced with new force. What if Judgment Day is not what we thought it was? That is when the questions began to take form, not in a booming voice, but in a clarity so undeniable it could not have been my own invention. They were not accusations. They were invitations. They were questions drenched in love and joy and celebration. And as I scribbled them down, trembling, I realized this moment was not only for me, It was for you, for anyone suffocating under the weight of fear. The first whisper I felt was almost playful in its correction. Jonathan, you've been asking the wrong thing. You want to know what I'll say when you fall short. I want to show you what I'll say because you are mine. My chest pounded, tears rising before I even understood why. He said, you've been preparing for a courtroom. I'm preparing a homecoming. You've expected interrogation. I'm planning celebration. You fear judgment. I anticipate joy. In that instant, everything in me began to unravel. His questions were not tools of condemnation. They were crowns of honor. They were designed to celebrate love, to mark growth, to rejoice in every moment of faith that had taken root in my life. And as the presence of God thickened in that room, I felt him ask me the very first question. Tell me about the people you loved well. Not list your failures, not explain your sins. Just tell me who you loved. I broke. Tears streamed because I had never expected grace to be the opening line of eternity. Yet there it was. The doorway to heaven was not an interrogation of guilt, but an invitation to share stories of love. And I knew, with trembling certainty, that 4 more questions were waiting to unfold. I sat there in that stillness, the pen trembling in my fingers, the paper beneath me already damp from tears. The first question, tell me about the people you loved well, was still echoing through my heart like a bell that refuses to stop ringing. It felt less like an interrogation and more like an embrace, a father kneeling to hear his child recount every story of kindness. In that moment, the room seemed to tilt. It wasn't just a prayer room anymore. It felt like a doorway into something eternal. And as I sat in that doorway, wave after wave of presence washing over me, a second question began to form with the same gentle authority as the first. It arrived not as a demand, but as an invitation. Show me the moments when you chose hope over despair. This question was softer still, but its weight nearly doubled me over. It was as if God had been there for every trembling decision, every quiet morning I got out of bed, when grief wanted to pin me down, every night I whispered a prayer for a future I couldn't see. He hadn't been tallying my mistakes, he had been cheering my resilience. While I had been counting my failures, he had been collecting my victories. I thought of the hidden mornings when I dragged myself to set after sleepless nights, still embodying the role of Jesus, still pouring out compassion to the cast and crew, even while my own heart questioned if it was real. I remembered the times I chose to believe that tomorrow could be kinder than today, even when every circumstance said otherwise. Those moments, tiny, ordinary, invisible to most, suddenly glowed in my memory as if heaven itself had been recording them. And then another question rising like a tide. Tell me about the grace you gave to others. It rolled through me like thunder and sunlight at once. God wanted to hear about the nights I forgave instead of retaliating, the days I chose patience instead of pride, the quiet hours when I showed mercy to someone who didn't even notice. All of it mattered. All of it had been seen. The ledger I feared was not a record of my failures, but a journal of my compassion. By then I wasn't weeping from shame. I was weeping from relief. This God, the real God, the one who met me in that room, was not a distant critic. He was a delighted father, watching with shining eyes as his child stumbled forward, choosing love, choosing hope, choosing grace, even when it hurt. The fourth question formed like a whisper carried on a breeze. Tell me about the times you trusted me when you couldn't see the outcome. This one pierced deepest. Trust had never been my easy road. My faith was often tangled with doubts, my obedience frequently trembling. But as the question settled into my heart, scenes from my own life flickered, moments when I said yes even when logic screamed no, when I stepped out even when the ground wasn't visible, when I loved someone who might not love me back. Heaven had noticed everyone, and then, like the final note of a song, the last question arrived and shattered me completely. Show me how you learned to receive my love. I couldn't hold the pen steady. This was not a question about achievements or milestones. It was about surrender. It was about the times I stopped performing and simply let myself be held. The nights I whispered, I believe you love me, through tears. The days I chose to rest instead of strive. The moments I let grace seep into the cracks I'd been hiding. Sitting there, I began to see the pattern. These 5 questions were not tests. They were treasures. They weren't meant to trap me, but to reveal me, to show me the life God had been watching all along, the life He wanted to celebrate. And in that celebration came a new kind of freedom. For the first time, I realized Judgment Day was not a courtroom but a festival, not a cross-examination but a homecoming banquet. God wasn't stockpiling accusations. He was preparing affirmations. He wasn't waiting to condemn. He was longing to applaud. As the questions poured out of heaven and into my notebook, I thought of you, of everyone who has been living under the same weight I carried, everyone who fears that final meeting, everyone who imagines God as a disappointed parent with arms crossed. I wanted to reach through the screen, through this story, and tell you, He has been keeping a very different record. Every act of love you've shown, every spark of hope you've clung to, every ounce of grace you've extended, every trembling moment of trust, every small yes to receiving His love, He has seen it all. Not one moment lost, not one gesture ignored, all of it treasured, all of it recorded. This realization shifted everything inside me. I stopped bracing for the gavel and started anticipating the applause. I stopped rehearsing apologies and began remembering love stories. I stopped fearing that I wasn't enough and started noticing how deeply I was known. Even as the tears slowed, my hands were still shaking with the weight of it, because this wasn't just a personal revelation. This was a message, a lifeline, a roadmap for anyone who has lived in fear of a God who was never angry the way they imagined. And there, in the hush of that prayer room, with the paper filled and my heart undone, I heard it again. Not as words, but as a certainty pressing against my soul. Judgment Day is not about exposing your worst. It's about celebrating your best. It's not about proving you belonged. It's about revealing how you loved. It's not about measuring your performance. It's about honoring your growth. Everything I had believed about God's final questions was being rewritten. And in that rewriting, my story and yours was being set free. I can still feel the sting of that moment, the way the questions rearranged everything inside me. They weren't a burden pressing me lower. They were like hands lifting me into light. For the first time in my life, I realized God's voice was not a prosecutor's, but a father's, and each question was a celebration of what He had seen in me all along. When He asked me to tell Him about the grace I gave to others, my heart broke open, because I remembered the countless times I had failed at grace, but what He wanted were the stories where I chose mercy anyway, the moments I forgave when it would have been easier to retaliate, the mornings I chose patience when my temper threatened to explode, the quiet nights I extended kindness to someone who would never know the cost. Those were the treasures He was collecting. Those were the moments heaven had kept record of, not the failures I replayed in shame. And then came the next question. Tell me about the times you trusted me when you couldn't see the outcome. That one sank deeper than the rest. I thought of seasons where faith felt like stepping into fog. The phone calls where provision hadn't come yet, the nights when prayers seemed unanswered, the hours when silence stretched so far I wondered if He was even listening. Yet I remembered. I had still whispered yes. I had still chosen to take the next step, to trust when logic screamed otherwise. I had stumbled forward blind, believing that if I fell, I would fall into His arms. Those steps weren't wasted, they were honored. But the fifth and final question unraveled me entirely. Show me how you learned to receive my love. I had expected God to measure me by what I did for Him, not by how much I allowed Him to do for me. Yet here was a Father not demanding performance, but delighting in surrender. Every time I stopped trying to prove myself, every moment I simply let His love reach me as I was, He smiled. The ledger I had feared all my life was not a tally of my flaws, but a diary of my surrender. That realization undid me, because I saw how much of my life I had lived like a man on trial, rehearsing apologies, bracing for condemnation. And all along, He had been watching with delight, collecting moments of growth like jewels. I thought He was frowning when I fell short, but in truth, He was beaming every time I stood again. The fear that had sat on my chest for decades began to dissolve. I had believed Judgment Day was about exposure, humiliation, punishment, but now I knew. It was about love, about recognition, about being fully seen and celebrated. It was not the end of the story, but the unveiling of its beauty. I began to imagine what that final encounter will look like. Not a gavel slamming, not scrolls of sins read aloud, but a Father saying, "Tell me. Tell me about the people you loved. Tell me the times you chose hope. Tell me the grace you gave, the trust you carried, the love you received. And then, as each memory is spoken aloud, I imagine his joy erupting, like a feast prepared long ago, a party already waiting. In that room, the tears that streamed down my face weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a freedom so new it frightened me. And as I wept, I felt God whisper again, not words of correction, but of delight. I have never been disappointed in you. I have always been delighted in you. I had been living as though heaven's spotlight was waiting to expose me. But now I saw it was waiting to honor me, to honor you, to honor every hidden act of love, every choice for hope, every spark of trust, every moment you let his love in. This changes everything. It changes how I see myself, how I live today, how I portray Jesus on screen, and how I understand tomorrow. And it left me with a conviction burning in my chest. People need to know this. People need to know that the questions God asks are not traps, but treasures. That his judgment is not condemnation, but celebration. That his heart has always been joy, and his delight has always been us. And as that truth settled, I realized I wasn't just crying for me anymore. I was crying for everyone who still believes they're on trial before a God who only ever wanted to celebrate them. When the revelation first hit me, it felt like the ground beneath my old beliefs gave way, and a brand new foundation was being laid under my feet. I wasn't just forgiven. I was celebrated. I wasn't barely tolerated. I was deeply treasured. And as that realization settled, I saw how much of my life I had wasted carrying shame that God had never placed on me. All those nights rehearsing apologies in my head, all those mornings I woke up afraid of failing him yet again, they dissolved in the presence of a father who had only ever been cheering for me. Through the flood of tears, I felt his voice, calm, gentle, steady, pressing into my spirit. I have never been disappointed in you. I have been delighted in you. I've never searched for reasons to cast you out. I've been gathering reasons to welcome you closer. I've never been obsessed with your failures. I've been celebrating every step of your growth. That truth broke something in me, because as a father myself, I thought of my own children. When they take a first step, I don't scold them for falling the second after. I cheer, I clap, I call everyone in the room to see their progress. I don't keep lists of their mistakes. I keep memories of their victories. And God was showing me that his heart toward me is like that, but multiplied beyond imagination. I began to replay scenes of my own journey. Seasons when I chose faith over fear, moments when I loved someone well even in my weakness, nights when I whispered yes through trembling lips. And instead of picturing God shaking his head at my shortcomings, I saw him smiling with pride, saying, "Do you remember when you did that? I was so proud of you. Do you remember when you chose to trust me there?" That brought me joy. The fear that had haunted my spiritual life for decades started melting away. No longer was I merely endured, I was embraced. No longer merely pardoned, I was prized. And that shift filled me with a peace I had never known, the peace of being fully seen and yet completely celebrated. But with that peace came an urgency, because I knew I wasn't alone. I thought about the friends, the family, the strangers I've met who carry the same suffocating fear of disappointing God. People who walk around convinced they've ruined their chance, that they're too broken, too inconsistent, too far gone, and I felt the ache of God's heart for them. He longs for them to see what he showed me, that his posture is not condemnation but celebration, not disappointment but delight. That urgency weighed on me like fire in my bones. This wasn't just a personal comfort, it was a message that had to be shared. People need to know that the day they've dreaded, the day of judgment, will actually be the greatest homecoming of their lives. They need to know that every act of love, every moment of hope, every spark of trust, every flicker of grace, every time they simply let God love them, it has all been noticed, recorded, and treasured. As my sobs quieted into stillness, another wave of peace settled over me, different from the first. It was no longer just the peace of being forgiven, it was the peace of being wanted, of being delighted in, of belonging without condition. And I knew in that moment this would change everything, not only for how I live, but for how I tell his story to the world. The Jesus I portray on screen could now be shown with greater authenticity, because I had felt the truth in my own bones. I could show his smile without hesitation, because I had finally seen it for myself. That prayer room had become more than four walls. It had become the place where judgment turned into joy, where fear gave way to freedom, where I learned that the God I once thought was tallying failures was actually keeping a record of love. And as I stood to my feet, the world outside hadn't shifted at all, but inside of me, everything was different. I rose from that prayer room like a man stepping out of a storm into sunlight. Nothing around me had changed. The same walls, the same air, the same faint hum of the world outside, but inside, every assumption I had carried about God had been upended. All my life I had prepared for a trial. Now I was preparing for a celebration. All my rehearsed apologies dissolved into gratitude. All my fear melted into anticipation. I walked through my house slowly, touching the door frames, the table, the familiar pictures on the wall, as though seeing them for the first time. Each object seemed to glow with a softer light, like the whole world had shifted from grayscale to color. And in that glow, I heard a quiet certainty rising. These 5 questions are not only waiting for you at the end of your life, they are shaping you right now. They are an invitation to live differently today. So I began to apply them like a compass. When a decision crossed my path, I asked, how can I love people well here? How can I choose hope instead of despair? How can I extend grace? How can I trust God when the outcome is hidden? How can I receive His love even in this moment? Each question was like a key turning in a lock, opening me into a freer, more joyful way of living. I stopped obsessing over avoiding mistakes and started focusing on practicing love. I stopped trying to earn His approval and started resting in His delight. I stopped bracing for judgment and began anticipating joy. And slowly, my days took on a different rhythm. Conversations felt lighter. Work felt less like performance and more like offering. My children's laughter seemed like an echo of heaven's delight. Even my portrayal of Jesus on screen began to shift. Not in technique, but in spirit. I could smile without acting, because I had felt His smile for myself. The fear that had dominated my spiritual life for decades was replaced by a freedom so spacious it startled me. I could make mistakes without imagining God's anger. I could wrestle with doubt without fearing rejection. I could grow without the crushing weight of perfectionism. My heart began to rest, and in that rest, love began to overflow more easily to others. I realized this is what God has wanted all along, not for us to spend our lives rehearsing defenses for Judgment Day, but to spend our lives living the love story that will be celebrated then, not to shrink back in shame, but to move forward in confidence, not to hide our growth, but to rejoice in it. As the days passed, I saw the 5 questions not as a future exam, but as a present roadmap, a way of life, an invitation to start practicing heaven's conversation now. Every small act of kindness, every choice for hope, every moment of grace, every trembling step of trust, every open-handed reception of love. They're not just passing moments, they're eternal seeds. And I knew this message could not stay with me alone. Too many people are still living as I once did, convinced God is stockpiling their failures. Too many are bracing for condemnation when they should be anticipating celebration. Too many are missing the joy of being known and loved right now. So I'm telling you, God isn't keeping a record of your wrongs. He's keeping a record of your love. He isn't rehearsing your failures. He's treasuring your growth. He's not preparing accusations. He's preparing affirmations. Judgment Day is not the day you fear. It's the day your love story is honored. If this truth is breaking something open in you the way it did in me, pause right now. Breathe. Let it sink in. You are not on probation. You are not one misstep from rejection. You are already loved, already celebrated, already delighted in. And because this isn't just for me, I want to pray for you. Father God, for every person hearing these words, especially those who have lived under fear and self-condemnation, reveal your true heart. Show them that your posture toward them is celebration, not condemnation. Show them that Judgment Day will be the greatest homecoming of their lives. Break the chains of shame and anxiety. Replace them with the confidence of being beloved children. Teach them to live from your delight instead of striving for your approval. Help them love people well, choose hope over despair, extend grace to others, trust you when they can't see the outcome, and receive your love more fully every day. Let them walk in the freedom you've given, knowing they are treasured beyond measure. If this message has touched you, I'd be honored if you'd share your story. Maybe a time you felt God's love in a powerful way, or how these 5 questions are reshaping your heart right now. You're not alone in this journey. We're learning together what it means to live from celebration instead of fear. And as we do, we're already rehearsing heaven's conversation, the one where God looks you in the eyes and says, tell me about the people you loved. Tell me about the hope you chose. Tell me about the grace you gave, the trust you held, the love you received. That is the day to come. That is the day you can begin living for right now.